Welcome back to Across the Pond. I'm Angus Scott in London. In the last show with our special US correspondent Leyla Gulen, we discussed the establishment of Khalistan. And in that discussion, we touched upon the interesting and, of course, deeply relevant subject of the India-China relations. Now, this fractious relationship between two potential future superpowers butting up against each other is indeed a very interesting one, because their relationship could likely dictate not just the future of Khalistan, but indeed the balance of global power. So today we're going to do a deep dive into this relationship and what it could mean for both the Khalistan movement and indeed global geopolitics. Leyla, welcome and thanks for joining us once again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Angus. Really enjoyed our conversation the last time, and I'm glad we're covering the subject again this time.
Indeed, yes. It's a fascinating subject. There's an awful lot involved in this, and it has such huge repercussions. So I think we'll try and condense it into at least a bite-sized discussion between us.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Well, it's a really important topic to dive into, so I'm glad we're going to sort of fill out some of those blanks that we didn't get to in the last time. But let's take a look at the history between these two nations. So asking you if you can give us sort of a brief summary of what's led to today's rather ambiguous relationship between these two growing superpowers.
Yes, indeed. And I think ambiguous is the word, because it has been, as I said in the introduction, a bit of a fractious relationship where there's sort of been almost like two big brothers butting heads against each other, almost for dominance. But yes, I think the best way of looking at this is sort of wind the clock back, as we like to do in these discussions, and just go through a bit of the history, that helps sort of build that context around where we are today. Now, as I have got into the habit of doing, let me do a little bit of a screen share here so we've got something to refer to, because this map really just gives a clue of what we're talking about. Now, this border between China and India, this obviously is the key between the two nations. This is the real root cause of a lot of this fractious tension between the two nations. It's a 3,500 kilometre border, and it's not actually really clearly defined. Loads of these areas are still in dispute. And if you look at the map, up here in the northwest, we've got Ladakh. This area, well, as you can see from this map, it says it's claimed by India, controlled by China. This sort of just north of Ladakh, this whole sort of area here. Likewise, in the northeastern region, we have this area of Arunachal Pradesh, likewise claimed by China, controlled by India. So again, you've got these two extremes of the borders that really both sides just cannot agree who actually should own it and control it. And it has been, as I say, this root cause of an awful lot of tension and indeed conflict between the two nations. Now, in amongst all this, of course, is good old Tibet. Poor Tibet, who, as many will recall, Tibet was invaded by China and its sovereignty was lost to China. And this in itself, this happened in 1950. It was when China officially annexed Tibet. And it ended Tibet's autonomy. And unfortunately, what it also ended was this. Tibet formed almost a buffer zone between China and India. It obviously existed for a very long time. India in itself, at the time, was a relatively new country, but Tibet did form this really useful buffer zone between the two nations. But when China invaded Tibet and took control of it, suddenly we lost a large amount of that buffer zone. And then now, of course, the border suddenly becomes a lot more fractious. Now, after that annexation, a few years later, 5 years later, 1959, there was a very large revolt in Tibet. The locals just said, we don't want this, unsurprisingly. But of course, unsurprisingly, it was brutally repressed by the Chinese army. And at that time, it forced the leader of Tibet, the Buddhist leader, the Dalai Lama, to flee. And where did he flee to? He fled to India. And of course, because of that, immediately that started ramping up tensions between the two countries yet further. Now, and that actually even resonates today. That, again, is still part of this fractious relationship, even these years later. Now, in 1960, as sort of the years unfolded, India rejected. China made propositions to India saying, look, let's try and resolve these territorial disputes once and for all. But India just rejected them out of hand. And that really triggered a huge ramp up in tensions between the two nations, which led, in fact, to 1962, this really strange little war. It was known as the 1962 Indochina War. And it was a strange little war, and I sort of use that just to almost describe how it unfolded. It wasn't a conventional war in the sense it only happened on land. There was no air battles, obviously no sea battles, there were no air assets, no aircraft were used. It was purely on land. But not just on land, it was up in the mountains, in the Himalayas and the foothills of the Himalayas. The whole war occurred above 4,000 metres. That's over 12,000 feet. So again, you can start to sort of get a feeling of what sort of war this was, about as challenging as it gets. But interestingly, the dynamics of that war actually set a lot of the scene, a lot of the context that we now sort of see with the resonance today. During that war, India, both sides actually at that time were fairly, medieval is quite too strong a word, but their forces, their military capabilities were very limited and very basic, very primitive, I think is probably the better word. So India turned to the West, it turned to the US and the UK, asking for more advanced military assets, assistance basically, and the West refused. Unsurprisingly, India then turned to its good old friend, the Soviet Union, who of course were more than happy to supply MiGs and all sorts of military assets. Now, despite that, actually China did in fact win this war, this sort of fairly limited conflict. And the aftermath of that, China then withdrew back to this, what was called the LAC, the Line of Actual Control, which actually was the LAC that existed before this war. So although technically China won the war, in fact, it ended back up in this sort of stalemate geographical situation. But 2 years later, and things again started becoming a little bit more interesting, because China, 2 years later, then officially became a nuclear power. Of course, this sent huge shockwaves, seismic shockwaves, political shockwaves, not just around the world, but certainly regionally, when China then suddenly becomes the only nuclear power in the region. Now, a few years later, 1974, India had its own first nuclear test, but India didn't actually become a nuclear power until 1998. But during the 70s, of course, raging Cold War, the Cold War, we have the East versus the West, the Soviet Union. Which side did India side with? Unsurprisingly, the Soviet Union. So all that time, during that really critical period, India sided with the Soviet Union. And as we know now, it's not really surprising, knowing the close ties between the FS or the KGB at the time and the Indian government. We do know that the KGB effectively bankrolled the Indian government through the 40s, 50s, and the 60s. Certainly that period. But China itself, again, this is rather interesting. China at that time sided with the United States and Pakistan during the Cold War. And that relationship, certainly with Pakistan, maintains to some degree today. And likewise, Pakistan with the West. And of course, Pakistan stands as the main regional rival to India. So again, you start to see the interesting dynamics between all the players, the regional players. Now, after sort of when the 70s merged and evolved into the 80s, relations did improve between the two nations, because both nations realised, hang on a second, the world's changing, commerce, industry, both powers realised they actually had huge potential economically. So both powers actually started to concentrate a bit more on economics and realised, look, we're wasting time fighting each other. Let's just build our own economies. So as a result, in 93 and 96, they had various sort of formal meetings, formal get-togethers, and they did agree officially to avoid military confrontation, reduce troops along that disputed border. Unsurprisingly, though, it didn't totally prevent all incidents, but as you can see, Leyla, basically the last few decades, it has been, decades of a very fractious, I keep using that word, fractious relationship between the two.
Yeah, so there are clearly decades of growing tension between the two countries. And you mentioned that this did actually break out into at least a limited war in 1962. Much has obviously happened since then. How do the two nations compare today from a military standpoint?
Yeah, I think the best way of showing this, I'll just do I'll do a little screen share. So it gives us something to sort of talk about. This is actually a very useful sort of breakdown of the two militaries and how they stack up, because it's actually quite telling. China has, we know, invested enormously in its military capability, particularly over the last 10, 15 years. It's widely reported in the press to a great concern of the West. But how does it actually stack up with India? Well, both nations have roughly the same populations. In fact, I think it was about 18 months ago, a year ago, China just overtook, sorry, I beg your pardon, India overtook China. China actually has a bit of a demographic issue because it had its one-child policy for many years. And unfortunately, it seems to have overshot that policy, and suddenly now its population is potentially facing a huge decline. But anyway, that's another issue. But population-wise, India is the slightly larger country. But when it comes to military, very different story. The army size, as you can see, China's army numbers over 2 million as opposed to just 1.5, less than 1.5 on India. India does have a larger reserve, but again, we don't know the quality of that reserve. It's almost a sort of a relatively meaningless statistic, that. But again, if we look at GDP, China dwarfs India. And again, this is something we'll talk about shortly, is about the economies of both sides. But China has a massive GDP. And of course, it is investing a large percentage of that GDP back into its military forces. And this is reflected when we actually look at the physical military assets. Excuse me, the number of fighter jets, again, more than twice the number of India's. It has 6,800, nearly 7,000 tanks, as opposed to India's just over 4,000. And then its vessels in its navy, over 700, as opposed to a very small Indian fleet of just under 300. So again, you can start to see this huge imbalance between the two nations. And again, very reflective of this vast investment that China has made in recent years, again, which has alerted the likes of, particularly the Trump administration to the potential conflicts that could arise up in the next 10, 20 years. And again, looking at things like the Taiwan Strait issues and things like that could potentially kick something off. Now, but of course, between the two nations themselves, I mean, despite this huge imbalance, which at the moment, I mean, God forbid both sides went to war, it's likely it would be probably very one-sided if it only involved these two sides. But what has happened over certainly recent years, there has been a lot of small skirmishes, let's call it, because of course we have this border region which remains conflicted. There are still these huge areas where both sides have troops on the ground physically facing each other, and whenever you get that, wherever it is in the world, troops just can't sometimes help themselves. It just takes a small trigger and they start shooting at each other, which eventually can potentially escalate into larger incidents. Now, the last, I would say the early part of this century, certainly up to about prior to Narendra Modi taking power, that period was mainly characterised probably by more political dialogue. There's not much going on, not much physical tension. There's a lot of political talk, but there was also behind the scenes a huge amount of infrastructure building on both sides. Both sides, again, realised that this this disputed border needed shoring up. Both sides feared an invasion by each other. So what they did, each side built these huge superhighways up to these border regions, Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh, so that allowed them to move large amounts of military assets, troops, tanks, whatever it happens to be, to those border regions very quickly. They built new roads, they built railways, they also built large military bases. So you can see this huge build-up of capability on either side of the border. So again, likewise, you can see how this, even just this on its own, even though it's peaceful, perfectly legal, it's ramping up those tensions. And essentially, both sides exerting their claim on that LAC and their territorial claims either side of it. Now, things really took a turn in 2012 when Xi Jinping took power in China, and 2014 when Narendra Modi took power in India. Sorry, Xi Jinping China, Narendra Modi in India. Both leaders campaigned and got elected, if that is the case in China, a communist state, but technically there were elections. Both leaders campaigned primarily on a nationalist ticket, almost an extremist nationalist ticket, certainly in the case of Narendra Modi. So they really leveraged that sort of patriotic, nationalistic fervour in their populations. Now, this in itself starts to ramp up tensions. And it certainly doesn't help the peaceful situation or any resolution over this border. So as a result of this, for example, and each side, again, we're always just poking and prodding across this border. For example, in 2017, China started building a road in Bhutan. In fact, let me just so our audience can picture this. Bhutan is that little nation there. just next to Arunachal Pradesh. So China in 2017 started constructing this road in Bhutan. But Bhutan was seen by India as neutral territory. So they saw this as a provocative move. They said, no, we had this sort of gentleman's agreement that Bhutan was out of bounds for both of us. You've just now started building roads in here, which again allows you to move military assets even closer again to our northeastern border. So of course this again ramped up an enormous amount of tension. So as a result of this, India obviously raised the alarm, and China at that stage did actually back down. And because the Indian troops did intervene to a very low level, there were some minor injuries on both sides. But as I say, 2 months after that incident, both sides decided to withdraw and just let's calm the situation. Various meetings then followed that over the next sort of couple of years to try and again reach some sort of agreement to lower down the tensions. But it only took a small trigger, and that happened in 2020. And again, it was a ridiculous situation. It was some Indian troops burned some tents of some of the Chinese soldiers just over the border or around that sort of disputed area. And they burnt down an observation tower on an area that actually India claimed as being its own. This is up in Kashmir, up in that northwestern region. And as a result of that, just both sides just set to each other physically. They started shooting each other, and as far as we know, we don't know the exact numbers, but India claims they lost 20 soldiers, China anything between 4 and 45. Again, very difficult to get the truth out of it, but basically that was the first loss of life on both sides since 1975. And following that, again, tensions rapidly mounted up, and it reached the news here in the West because suddenly the West was thinking, hang on, this is suddenly starting to get very serious. Both sides deployed over 50,000 troops to the border, extra troops on top of the troops that were already there. So again, tensions reaching up this quite scary level. Added to that, the following year, China then passed a law internally. It was called the Land Borders Law. And this justified itself legally, internally, domestically, to allow to move military and military assets and build military and civil infrastructure right up against that border. So again, bolstering its capability along the border. But fortunately, common sense prevailed. But interestingly, other factors started to come into this play, because in 2024, again, as tensions were really reaching a bit of a head, China and India met. Again, the leaders met, or their administrations met, and they agreed mutually to troop disengagement. They said, no, let's pull back our troops, let's calm things down. Yes, we can resume patrols, but although there is no definitive border, let's just agree to disagree, which is great. Everything calmed down. But the timing was interesting. Now, why on earth at that time did China and India suddenly, who were really at each other's throats, ready to rip each other apart, why did they suddenly back down in an almost overnight situation? Well, as the sort of news filtered out, it was believed that both sides realised that they reached a stalemate. Both were growing superpowers. In the last few years, it's very clear India and China are going to be the next superpowers. And both countries realise this. And they've realised that with this line of control between them, they're pouring huge amounts of resources, both manpower and financial resources, not least military resources, against these borders for what? They know they're not going to war. They don't want to go to war. These two nations do not want to go to war with each other because neither side will win, probably. Now, one might, but ultimately they're both nuclear powers. So nobody on this planet wants India and China to go to war. So it's believed that stalemate, they said, okay, let's just forget this. Let's just calm things down. Great. But also there was another factor come into play, and we'll start talking about this next, is that India's economy by now, of course, India's economy is growing massively, but so is China's. India's economy at that time and going forward is heavily reliant upon China. It needs China's components, it needs China's raw materials. India has suddenly realised, oh dear, we're in a situation here. We need China. We can't fall out with China because our economy, much of its foundations is built on China, Leyla. That's the problem.
Yeah, indeed, yes. Well, let's move away from conflict and instead look at another important area, that of trade and commerce. We know both India and China have economies set to dominate the future, and both nations have openly stated their ambitions to be economic superpowers. But how do the countries compare, and how are economic relations faring between the two?
Yes, there's, as I say, both nations superpowers, both nations really building up their economies, trying to grow their economies in competition with each other. And as we see, the Chinese economy absolutely dwarfs the Indian economy, relatively speaking, at this time. But India is ambitious. So I'm going to show you some more facts and figures, actually, just again to help our audience visualize what's going on. And as you can see from here, India last year, as of last year, this gives a relative clue really to how the balance, how the dynamics play between these two nations. India imported $120 billion worth of goods from China last year, but only exported 18 billion back to China. So you can see this huge trade deficit between the two nations. Again, another reason why India has backed down, certainly physically, from China. It's so reliant on Chinese goods. China's key exports to India include one of the key areas is electronic components, over $70 billion worth each year, and chemicals, again feeding its industrial base, feeding its pharmaceutical base, up to about $20 billion a year. Now these exports are absolutely critical for India's booming tech sector and the pharmaceutical sectors, its two main key economic engines of the nation. But as a result, and because India has recognised this huge trade imbalance, India has implemented all sorts of policies to try and reduce its trade dependence on China. Now, it's adopted all sorts of different tactics. These include, for example, trying to incentivise its own manufacturers, giving tax benefits, incentives to its own industries to say, look, let's build it here. Instead of importing it from China, let's build it here, and we'll incentivise it through lower taxes, etc. It's also imposed all sorts of different tariffs on various goods from China, because China, unfortunately, has been guilty, and it's not actually just with India, it's other nations as well, but China is very guilty of offloading a lot of its goods, tat as we call it in the West, Chinese tat, at really low prices. And it's been doing that with India. It's called dumping. It's been dumping a lot of its products below the cost, actual production cost, into the Indian market. And this, of course, has really been undermining. It's been really dissolving the foundations of the Indian market, particularly the Indian manufacturing base. But also, India then is tackled it from a different perspective as well. It's also increased its minimum quality standards for a lot of goods. So in other words, China just can't mass produce its tat and export it to India. India's deliberately upped the threshold of quality control. And so, in other words, a huge amount of Chinese goods now just do not pass quality standards that India have raised, again, to try and reduce that trade deficit. So, but when we look at, in terms of, I mean, that's in terms of just simple manufacturing and export-import. When we look at the service sector, and particularly the investment sector, China has been a massive investor in India, and particularly in Indian startups, Indian industry. Chinese investments last year in India totaled over $2.5 billion. But that only accounted for 0.37% of India's total investment. So although it sounds a lot on its own, in fact, it's actually relatively small. And from the mid to late 2010s, Chinese corporations and these huge tech giants, they're called Tencent, Alibaba, there's a handful of them. They're sort of the Chinese equivalent to Google and Microsoft. Tencent and Alibaba were huge investors in India's tech unicorns, as they're called. The unicorns are these startups that are suddenly worth over $1 billion. I mean, it's all very paper value, but ultimately, these Chinese tech giants have been hugely investing in Indian unicorns, because they see huge potential in these things. Now, after that clash back in 2020, that sort of conflict that I referred to 5 years ago, India, as a result of that, India shifted its own foreign investment policy. And it decided, look, we need to, as a result of this huge trade imbalance, we need to start shoring up our own economic defences against China. We are too beholden to China. Basically, China has got us over a barrel. We need to do something about this. So not least trying to incentivise its own industrial base to grow. It's also putting up all sorts of different barriers. I've talked about tariffs and stuff and the quality standards. But what it's also done, it's done it from a regulatory framework as well. It's now required foreign investors, but particularly Chinese investors, to get government approval, Indian government approval to invest in India. And so here's some facts and figures that actually demonstrate how effective this has been. Between 2020 and 2023, that was the first 3 years after this was brought in, India rejected 58 Chinese investment proposals and put a further 14 on hold. Now, before that, India was an open book. China just came in, invested where it wanted. But after that, over 60 huge investment proposals were just said, nope, blanket ban, regulatory, unapproved, that's it. It also India banned 267 Chinese applications from the likes of these tech giants, TikTok, WeChat, Shein, citing national security concerns. Again, so you can see how India's whole attitude has really changed, certainly from an economic perspective. It's now it's suddenly seeing, China as this economic enemy, not just a military enemy as well. And so, as of 2025, again, some more facts and figures, at least 36 apps have been banned, Chinese apps, under compliance with new local ownership and data rules. So again, you can see how India has just put up all these huge barriers, both in the manufacturing and the service and the investment sectors. Now, one other bit I just want to quickly touch on again, which is an important area, and of course very relevant to both these nations. Both nations are huge in the tech sector, India particularly. Technology and the AI sector, huge areas for both sides. Now, China's tech sector is largely state-controlled. India's tech sector is primarily privately controlled. As a result, China is able to roll out the latest technologies very quickly and at very large scale. Some examples of that: facial recognition, electric vehicles. They're now dominating these sorts of markets because, again, the government, it's a state thing. You will do it and you will deliver it by X, or you go to prison. Basically, it's almost as brutal as that. But of course, the benefits of that come with the cons, which is more state intervention, as I just mentioned, and of course censorship. In other words, they're not free. It comes with this state communist straitjacket. Now, in 2021, India launched a $10 billion program to boost its semiconductor industry to compete, try and go head on with China. Now, India's semiconductor market value grew from 22 billion in 2021 to 52 billion in 2024. So again, you can see how massively it's grown. Compare that to China, though. China last year invested $183 billion. So again, you can see China is dwarfing India in terms of its investment. In AI specifically, China invested $58 billion in AI, India 1.25. So that's 58 billion compared to 1.25. So again, you can start to see the difference in terms of investment. And of course, this is going to, the impact of this isn't seen today, but it will be seen in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. So as a result, India is now actually, although India previously was very isolationist, particularly when it came to the West, it's now starting to build technology partnerships more with the US, the European Union, Japan, Australia. In other words, the Western democracies. And of course, the Western democracies are saying, yes, we want this. They're trying to get India into alignment with the Western democracies. But China, alternatively, has prioritised ties with its Belt and Road initiative. Belt and Road, of course, is a huge initiative. It's rolling out to export China capabilities across the world. So there you go, Leyla. That's sort of the economic summary. But as you can see, tensions still abound between the two nations.
Yeah, indeed. And I can see why. A very stark contrast there. Both nations, though, have been quite public about their ambitions on the global stage. They are both keen to take on the existing dominance of the West, and particularly the U.S., of course. But the UN forms a global body of, let's call it, arbitration within which, again, both countries are keen to promote their own involvement. So could you give us an overview of how they sit in this context and how you see the future potentially unfolding?
Yes, it's very clear that both nations see themselves as leaders. Both nations want to lead that Asian region, this huge Asian region. But they also both see each other as competitors. So they are both leaders and both competitors in that whole region and what's called the Global South. Now, as I've said, both are potential future superpowers. But neither wants the other to dominate, of course. And both actually believe in what's called a multipolar international system. In other words, up until in recent years, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the world has essentially been dominated by one superpower. That is, of course, the United States. And as a result, China and India, but unsurprisingly, don't like this situation. So what they've both said is we actually want a multipolar system. We want a system that actually has more than one superpower. And there is space in this world for more than one superpower, more than two potentially. So, of course, they counted themselves in that. And, of course, so both sides don't want the other side to replace the United States. And India specifically does not want China to replace the United States in that new global world order. So, of course, there's all sorts of areas that this impacts. And, of course, one of the biggest areas is the currency. I'm just going to go back to screen share, just sort of help you just sum up the sort of key points of this. India runs the rupee. China, the renminbi, and both sides are trying to push their own currencies globally. They're trying to compete with the dollar. The dollar is the global currency. Oil is primarily traded in US dollars as a prime example. But we do know China and even India are both trying very hard to set up different sets of commercial infrastructure that actually uses their own currencies to try and rival the dominance of the dollar. So, of course, they're both using their currencies in this sort of global battle for dominance. In terms of groups, commercial groups, alliances, coalitions, let's call them, India is a member of several. It did actually recently join the RCEP. This was a free trade agreement between 15 other Asia-Pacific countries. But it did actually leave that one specifically because China started getting involved in this. And China, as we've talked about regularly, it is very ambitious. It's got its network has spread its tentacles into all the global institutions. It dominates the World Health Organization. It's now starting to really have a huge dominance is maybe too strong a word, but it has a disproportionate balance in the United Nations. So all these key global institutions, it is starting to dominate. This is upsetting not just the West, but it's upsetting India. But likewise, in the more regional trade groups, it's doing the same thing. So India is starting to move out of these. So the RCEP, this free trade agreement in the Asia region, India's pulled out of that for that same reason. And India has definitely said no to this Belt and Road Initiative, this huge initiative that is actually affecting not just the whole of Asia, but it stretches into the Middle East, even into Europe. It's almost like the old Silk Route. This is how important this is. But India has said no, we don't want any part of that, particularly because actually a lot of the infrastructure involved in Belt and Road includes Pakistan, that age-old rival of India. So anything that involves Pakistan, India definitely doesn't want a part of it. India also joined the China-led International Organization of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, I think I've got that right. But although it still remains in that, again, it's almost become like a silent partner. It's distancing itself from all these trade groups that China is now starting to dominate. So then it does actually make a question the credibility of these organizations themselves if they're all just becoming just proxies of China. But interestingly, India has not prioritized engagement with the West, particularly the United States, despite the fact that the US is trying to seduce India on side, trying to seduce it away from both China and Russia. But India has played a very clever game for many years, and that is playing. It takes all the different policies from different sides that suits India best. So it doesn't align with the East, it doesn't align with the West, but it picks sides where it suits India's interests most of all. Now that's fine, that works to an extent. But there are times, and there will come a time eventually when it will have to pick a side. And again, this touches on something we've talked a lot about, which is India a reliable ally of the West? No, it's not, because of this very reason. Because we cannot, a good test of this, if we shared intelligence with India, could we trust India not to tell anybody else? By anybody else, of course, I'm referring to the Soviet Union, Russia, or even China. No, we cannot trust. Yes, we will share a limited amount of intelligence, particularly when it comes to Islamic terrorism, for example, but we will not trust India with other sets of intelligence, particularly when it relates to Russia or China. And that in itself is a true test of whether India is a reliable ally of the West. Now, interestingly, here's a big thing, a recent development. China, well, India itself, let me rephrase this. I'll come back to it. United Nations, which I've touched on already. The United Nations Security Council has 5 permanent members. On one side, you have Russia and China. On the other side, you have the UK, United States and France. So there's this imbalance of these 5 permanent members. Now, that's actually worked very well for many years. Of course, it's worked better for the West than the East because, of course, there is this imbalance where the West dominates over the East, over Russia and China. India wants to join that party. India wants to become a permanent member. Now, if India did become a permanent member and it aligned with Russia, as we know it probably will, and indeed it aligned with China, suddenly you can see the global dynamics in the UN change completely. Suddenly, we don't have 3 against 2, it's 3 against 3. Now, the UN Security Council is important because it's the only council in the UN that can pass resolutions that are binding on all its members. So what that council decides, no country who is a member of the UN can say no to it. So again, if India joins that and the 3 against 3, if those 3 prevail in something, that means their policy prevails over the whole United Nations. The West have enjoyed, up till now, dominance over that. Things could change. Now, this is, again, where it gets interesting. India wants to do this. You'd have thought China would have supported this. It doesn't. Interestingly, China does not support India's bid to join the Security Council. Why? Because India, by doing so, suddenly starts to have a say in global affairs. China is the only member from Asia. China doesn't want to lose that. In other words, China's voice currently, although it is a minority in those 5, it is the only representative from Asia. So it has a much better chance of pushing its policy on the UN. If India joined it, what essentially is on the face of it an ally, but in fact actually is a competitor, suddenly China is no longer the only Asian voice on that committee. So you can start to see the interesting dynamics in play there. So it is likely on that basis that India will not join that top table, much to India's disappointment, I dare say. Now, again, talking about the UN, again, just to give you some idea of the balance and the dynamics in the United Nations of India and China and how they align between East and West. In the General Assembly voting over recent years, India has aligned or voted with China 81% of the time. So every time China's put up a proposal, India has aligned and voted for it 81% of the time. Now, when it comes to the US, how often did India vote with the US? 38%. Now you start to get a flavour of where India's alliances really are. It's voting 81% of the time with China and only 38% with the US. So clearly it's favouring China. Likewise, turn that the other way, China, how does China feel? China's votes aligned with the US only 28% of the time. Now, that's not surprising. We know China is essentially on opposite sides to the US. That's not a surprise. But what is a surprise is how India's allegiance is clearly more to China than it is to the US. Supposedly, this democratic rule of law nation of India. So that in itself is a very telling statistic. Now, let's wrap this sort of section up about sort of global dynamics with these sort of potential future scenarios. Which way could it go? And how do we see the future unfolding? Well, there are, as you can see from this list here, there are 4 key areas, key issues that really impact these relations between the two nations. Of course, we have the line of control, the territorial dispute. So that is never going to go away. There's always going to be this issue between those two. We have this economic dependence that India has on China. How is that going to unfold? China economically dominates India. Is that going to change? We do know India's working very hard to change that dynamic. Foreign policy, especially with relations with Pakistan and the US. The West, as I said, is trying so hard to seduce India away from Russia and China. Is it succeeding? We don't know. It's very hard to say. And then, of course, we have the public opinion, domestic policies under both leaders. As I said earlier, they are both very nationalist. They're well, in terms of Narendra Modi, he's an extremist nationalist. He is a Hindutva proxy. He represents this extremist right-wing nationalist agenda that's controlling India. But Xi Jinping, likewise, he controls communist China. So what happens when those both go? Who knows? But is likely, again, this extremist element will maintain it. But again, that could dictate which way these two nations go. But in terms of the future scenarios, 3 probable scenarios. Firstly, they could continue in this sort of competitive coexistence. Now, this assumes that they maintain this sort of dual-track relationship. And this involves growing their economic ties between them two, managing this border dispute without actually reaching a solution. In other words, let's just manage it. Let's just agree to disagree. Yes, of course, there's always going to be skirmishes, but let's not let it ever escalate beyond local skirmishes. Now, India's trade deficit here remains significant, and minor border clashes will no doubt occur. But China is likely to strengthen its ties with Pakistan. But in that case, will India try and increase its ties with the US? Probably not. So we don't know. This competitive coexistence is probably the most ambiguous. Which way? What will that lead to? It's almost like a stalemate sort of situation that needs solution. And in other words, this can only go on for so long. And ultimately, it will have to get resolved one way or the other. So again, I say that competitive coexistence is almost a state of flux that can only happen for a limited period of time. Alternatively, we have this strategic cooperation, and this is where they actually decide to actually tie together much more closely, and they agree to start with on a defined border between both nations, and they withdraw all their troops. In other words, they agree this border. That's it. That whole issue is removed forever. That's it. And then they increase their bilateral investments. They start investing a lot more in each other, especially in the key sectors like the two areas that they're particularly both strong in, which is electronics, pharmaceuticals. And again, these two nations together could become the giants of these industries. They will just totally dominate global electronics and global pharmaceuticals. And then ultimately, China-US relations improve. India-Pakistan relations improve. And then everybody gets on and everybody lives happily ever after. Now, is that likely to happen? Nah, probably not. I think this is probably the most optimistic scenario. Culturally, all these nations are so culturally diverse, it is very unlikely that's going to happen.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, sorry,
as a final question, I'm sorry?
Oh, sorry, I was just going to just do one final, almost Armageddon scenario, and that is this sort of the armed conflict scenario. And this ultimately is God forbid it ever came to this. And this is where economic ties just completely fall apart. And ultimately, we do know China is doing its very best to encircle India militarily with its naval bases in Sri Lanka, for example, throughout the Indian Ocean, etc. So ultimately, this could potentially lead to conflict. We do know regionally this would be catastrophic. Both nations dominate geographically this huge area of Asia. And they do both have this no first use nuclear doctrine, where in other words, they both said, we will not be the first to use a nuclear weapon. But who knows? If it comes to an existential risk between the pair of them, who knows? And if one of them fires a nuclear weapon, it's game over. So that is the third possible solution. I think likely it will be a hybrid of all these. I don't think it will come to armed conflict. I think it will be a hybrid solution where both powers will just butt heads for the next 30 years until they both become global superpowers. And I think it will take 50 to 100 years to actually resolve it one way or the other.
Yes. Well, very fascinating stuff. Well, as a final question, I know we only have about a minute or two left here, but we did talk about the establishment of Khalistan in our last discussion. So how do you think that concept now sits in the context of the potential scenarios you've just outlined?
Yes, indeed. And I think this really comes back to our last discussion. Khalistan is the ultimate solution for this region. The dynamics which I've touched upon are huge. India, Pakistan are never going to resolve their issues between them. Culturally, ideologically, they are poles apart. I just cannot see a scenario where they are ever going to be at peace with each other. That whole Khalistan buffer zone solves that problem. Likewise, with China, we have the China-Indian relations. If they again, likewise, become to sort of an escalation of conflict, the existence of Khalistan in that area, probably with Western military assets, almost acts as a peacemaker. It's almost that sort of ambassadorial presence in the region saying, look, guys, let's calm it down. We're here as well. We're not going to let you two come to blows. We've got military assets here. And it's almost like, although the shared border between all those three nations, India and Khalistan and China, will actually be relatively small, its geopolitical presence will actually be disproportionately larger. And I suspect that having Khalistan in that region, and therefore a proxy for Western democracies, it will be the peacemaker in that region. This is why, again, I think all the regions locally should have Khalistan. Whether they like it or not, it will be, in the long term, the ultimate solution for that region. The West, I believe, certainly need it and want it. Pakistan, I believe, actually would acquiesce to it. India, reluctantly so. China, I think China could be a big supporter. I think China would want to invest in it. It sees it as a huge potential market. I don't know if Khalistan will let it. But ultimately, to me, Khalistan would be the peacemaker in that region. That's why it's so important.
Very interesting. Fascinating stuff, Angus. Well, thank you again. Always a pleasure.
Indeed, absolutely, Leyla. It's an absolute pleasure talking to you once again. Fascinating subject. And as I said, it's nice to finish on the message of Khalistan because, as we say, we always conclude Khalistan is necessary.
That's right. That's right. And certainly we can elaborate on that the next time.
Indeed. Well, we'll look forward to our next discussion. But as time runs away with us, we must draw things to a close once again. Thanks once again to Leyla for joining us. But thank you to our audience once again for watching the show. And we will see you next time.